of moments to just be in your own body. Be grateful for the breath that you have that Breonna can't have.
In this year, they just have a huge burst of coal. They've been building up the last couple of years, but this year they just went over the top. They're building more coal-fired power plants this year, in the first 6 months of this year, than they built in all of 2018 and 19.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Maine to New York City and points west. The system is working as it was designed. The white supremacy system, that is. Its dominance was shown again in Louisville, Kentucky, where a state attorney general and the grand jury he summoned could not find any reason to put officers on trial for the killing of Breonna Taylor. In New Haven, hundreds protested on the Green and later marched in city streets.
Justice looks like not only getting the indictment that we deserve, and that she deserves, and that the family deserves, and that the organizers in Louisville deserve. It was her having the breath in the lungs that we have right now. So please take a couple of moments to just be in your own body. Be grateful for the breath that you have that Breonna can't have, that Sandra can't have, that Corinne Gaines can't have, that Nina Pop and Tony McVeigh can't have. Be in your bodies right now. And remember that our liberation is bound to one another. We do this not only for Breonna. We do this for every marginalized group in our society and in this country. Because when Black people are free, everyone is free. Everyone is free. Every single one. We are free. We are asking for basic rights. Basic rights. To be able to sleep peacefully while we just fought a pandemic all night and all day, risking our lives in a pandemic. We deserve to sleep peacefully without terrorists and assassinators coming into our home and killing us with multiple shots. We are asking for basic rights.
Laura, why did you come today?
I came here for justice for Breonna Taylor. The verdict that was read by the grand jury yesterday was wrong. Those officers should have been charged. And Black Lives Matter, and I'm really disgusted and tired of no charges being brought against these unjust murders of Black men and women. And it really needs to stop.
Justice for Breonna Taylor! Justice for Breonna Taylor! Say her name! 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 Breonna Taylor! Well, continue to keep breathing. We will be back shortly as soon as all the rest of our organizers come, because we don't leave people behind. Right? Thank you.
We point out that there was no permit for that march, but city officials realized it was a heartfelt and necessary protest. They didn't send police to break it up. And no one tried to drive through the crowd, as they did in West Haven on July 5th, an act who people online later said they would imitate. Now, some very bad climate news. Activists for years have correctly condemned oil, gas, and coal companies and their servants in government for all the harm that they've done. However, they haven't been looking at China. This is Richard Smith's new book, China's Engine of Environmental Collapse. It explains that the good China is doing with solar panels and windmills is outbalanced by its incredible and dangerous expansion of coal-burning power plants. Smith spoke several weeks ago in an online webinar.
This book began some years ago with a question: why is pollution so out of control in China? Let me just set my timer here. Okay. For example, China's CO2 emissions are more than double those of the US, with a GDP just 63% as large in 2017. In 2018, its emissions were nearly equal to the emissions of those of the next 5 largest emitters, the US, India, Russia, Japan, and Germany combined. Yet China's population is at least 68% as large, and its GDP just 32% as large as those countries combined. Moreover, developed world emissions have been declining. The US emissions have declined from their peak in 2007, and EU emissions have trended downward for 3 decades. Japan's dropped 13% since 2013, by this year. To be sure, those declines are not enough to stop global warming and not even enough to meet their Paris pledges, but at least they're declines. By contrast, China's emissions have relentlessly grown, quadrupling between 1900 and 2017, then growing another 4% per year since then. As the world's largest emitter, accounting for 30% of the total global emissions, against 15% for the US, 9% for EU 28, 7% for India, 5% for Russia, and 4% for Japan, that makes China by far the leading driver of global warming, and thus, in effect, the leading driver of climate collapse. Well, why is that? In 2017, when President Trump announced that the US would withdraw from the Paris Agreement, Xi Jinping, the president of China, termed it a hard-won achievement that all signatories must stick to. Walking away from that pact would endanger future generations, he said. And yet that's exactly what he's done. Instead of prioritizing clean energy, Xi's government has slashed funding for wind and solar power in the last couple of years, while ramping up spending on new coal-fired power plants. This prompted related questions. Why do China's state-owned industries produce steel and aluminum they can't sell? It gets dumped on the world market at a loss or piles up in stockyards. Why build more coal-fired power plants when it's already got too many and they're running at half speed? Why build new high-speed trains that run empty, or subways in small towns and empty airports and empty highways? Why is there so much over-construction, empty blocks of apartments like in Wuhan that got blown up and then demolished to start all over again? Why build skyscrapers and ghost cities with no tenants and no prospective residents? Right now, the country is in plan, producing 3.4 billion residences under construction and planning for a country with 1.4 billion people. So why is that? And why is corruption so out of control? After all, it's often argued in the West, like in the Economist magazine, the Wall Street Journal, and so forth, that China's dictatorship ought to be an advantage. It should be able to compel producers to stop or else. Xi should be able to ram through the transition to renewables and stop corruption in its tracks. So why don't they do these things? In my book, I try to answer these questions by constructing a Marxist mode of production theorization of China's political economy. I contend that China is a hybrid, bureaucratic, collectivist, capitalist economy. Roughly speaking, it's a tripartite economy. About 50% of the economy is state-owned, state-planned. About 30% is the joint venture, mostly capitalist economy in the archipelago of special economic zones along the coast and elsewhere in interior China too. And about 20% of the economy is the private economy. This book is concerned mostly with the state sector, except the first chapter, which is about the special economic zones, the capitalist sector. The rest is concerned with the state sector because it's the biggest, it's the most important part of the economy. It overdetermines the rest, and it exemplifies the irrationalities and pollution problems just noted, plus a lot of others. I argue here, I propose this argument here, that China's bureaucratic rulers are driven by 3 imperatives that are at least as powerful, if not more powerful, drivers of hypergrowth than profit maximization under capitalism. First, they must maximize economic growth and self-sufficient industrialization. Why? Because as a state-based ruling class, they're not based on enterprises or investments in the world economy. They're a state-based ruling class in a nation, in a world dominated by more advanced capitalist economies and societies. Mao and his successors understood, like Khrushchev and Stalin before him in the Soviet Union, that they must catch up and overtake the United States, build a relatively self-sufficient high-tech superpower economy shielded from Western takeover, and so on. The Soviets' failure to win the economic arms race with the US, economics and arms race with the US, doomed the Communist Party. Mao and his successors, Deng Xiaoping, and those following him, notably Xi Jinping, have been determined to avoid that error. Secondly, they need to maximize employment. In capitalist economies, employers have no obligation to the unemployed. If workers are laid off, it's not the capitalist problem. It's not even the government's problem, except in severe downturns like the Depression, when they could face unrest. But because the Communist Party was in fact once a workers' party, it can't completely ignore the workers, since the government has to support them in the end anyway, whether even if it's just what the Chinese call the dibao, which is the minimum subsistence payment. It's better to have them producing something than just milling about and probably making trouble. And that's why the government seeks to keep them busy, by generating jobs. 5-year plans regularly include job creation targets. Yet keeping China's hundreds of millions of workers working, producing something ends up meaning producing superfluous steel, needless infrastructure, ghost cities, and so on. Maximizing employment is a major driver of overproduction, overconstruction, and profligate waste of energy and resources across the economy, and the pollution that flows from them. Thirdly, they must seek to maximize consumption and consumerism. In the wake of the collapse of this Soviet Communist Party in 1991, the Chinese Communist Party's own near-death experience with the Tiananmen protests in 1989, the party leadership resolved to create a kind of mass consumer society and raise incomes in order to focus people's attention on consumption and take their minds off politics. So those are the main drivers emanating from Beijing, and there are other drivers. In my book, I describe all the drivers from local provinces, municipalities, local governments, and so on, how they stand to gain by generating more growth. Okay, this book then discusses the contradictions and barriers built into the system, barriers to environmental reform. For example, why Xi can't rein in his polluters. And the central reason there, I contend, is that because they're not employees like under capitalism, they can't generally be fired. They're members of the same party bureaucratic ruling class as Xi Jinping, and so they can, if they have good bases and good with the connections, what the Chinese call guanxi connections, if they have good relations with higher ups and down below, they can defy Beijing with impunity when it suits their economic interests to keep polluting but profitable factories going. Secondly, why why, on the other hand, Xi Jinping doesn't really try very hard to suppress pollution for all his ecological civilization talk and so forth. His overriding priority is to maximize growth, build up state-owned industrial champions, to overtake the US. To get there, he has to prioritize hypergrowth over the environment and let the polluters pollute, even if this ends in climate collapse. Of course, Western capitalist economies led by the US are racing China to the brink of climate collapse too. And likewise, they can't prioritize people over planet either. But what's uniquely dangerous about the Chinese case is first, that its emissions are so huge, nearly a third of total global emissions, and growing so fast that scientists tell us they could eventually even doom the climate on their own, kind of pretty much regardless of what the rest of the world does. And secondly, while we in the West still have the freedom to mobilize and fight our governments and companies whose emissions threaten our survival, and our collective actions have in fact restrained, if far from enough, the growth of emissions in the US and Europe and so forth. By contrast, the Communist Party runs a police state that ruthlessly suppresses all resistance. Given Xi's great firewall, most Chinese have no idea that China's emissions are so huge. And there's no discussion of the concept of overproduction's impact on the planet in China. It's just not, you just don't read or see anything like this. And even if they did, because it's such a fearsome state, they can't resist. So what to do? Well, in the conclusion, I argued that the only solution for China, as for the US and other industrialized nations, is to grab the emergency brake, declare a climate emergency, suppress production, shut down, phase out, retrench fossil fuel-based industries around the world, significantly deindustrialize. In China's case, that would mean shutting down the all but essential coal-fired power plants, and shut down the auto industry and abolish disposable industries, and shut down all but essential aviation and construction, and create a public works program for those displaced workers, and initiated an environmental restoration program, and many other things. Of course, all of this would require a social revolution to eco-socialism in China and the US, and any such revolution seems just completely impossible in either case. Yet I end the book on what I think is a kind of realistic, if cautiously optimistic note. The CCP, the Communist Party, can't last forever. It's facing insoluble contradictions that its standard answer for everything, growth, is just making its problems worse. It faces growing opposition both in China and beyond, even though it's not so visible at the moment, although except in Hong Kong. And the party itself is fracturing, as the expulsion of Tsai Xia, a professor at the party school last week, demonstrates. It faces growing resistance in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and in Inner Mongolia too. So I think that these problems are insoluble. In the end, the Communist Party is going into the dustbin of history. Hopefully we'll have time to discuss these issues a bit. I'm going to stop right there earlier than I planned, because I want to take up so many questions that people have raised. Okay, thank you.
Right, thanks for that. I'll just shift gears slightly too, and kind of refer to something I feel like is a kind of a sentiment I've heard a lot in the Western left and progressives, where people recognize or admit the fact that China has been responsible for a lot of the emissions and a lot of this kind of climate change problem. But then people see news here and there, right? Of like, at least they're spending more energy and resources on renewable energy sources and other types of kind of green friendly policies and stuff like that, right? And this is a report that I think, Richard, you just sent me a couple of days ago on from Global Energy Monitor that actually shows, right, the opposite of this type of effect, that China has 250 gigawatts of new coal power plants in construction and planning. And that's actually more than a 20% increase from last year, an amount that's larger than entire coal fleets of the US and India. And in the same kind of equation, China is also defunding or not having enough in terms of the solar and wind energy stuff, and ramping up still on coal-fired power plants, while at the same time there already is kind of an excess amount of coal-fired capacity, while solar and wind investments continue to trail way behind because of poor planning and grid construction, as you point out in your book. Can you go more into that, and why still kind of ramp up on that coal-fired capacity thing? I think you mentioned this kind of rationale, calculus, and profit maximization that's kind of intrinsic to China's growth plan. Can you expand more on that aspect of things and dispel some of these kind of myths, right?
Yeah, happy to. With this issue, there are certain things about China's economy that are different from capitalism, and there are certain things that are similar. So, with the issue of it's ironic. What's so ironic about China is that it leads the world in the production of solar panels, photovoltaic panels, by far. It produces like 30% of the world, or more than that, of the world's solar panels. It dominates the world market. It also leads in the production of windmills. And it's got more installed capacity of both of those in China than the rest of the world almost together. So the question is, yet at the same time, it's maximizing the growth of coal industry. And yet, Xi Jinping swore, I mean, they promised in 2015 at the Paris climate agreement talks to reduce the reliance on coal and sharply boost the reliance on renewable energy. So why are they backtracking? Well, there are two sets of reasons. First of all, in China's political economy, it's very compartmentalized by provinces, by municipalities, counties. Everybody's, from the days of Mao, the economy everybody tried to be as self-sufficient as possible in the old planned economy. And that was because they couldn't depend on getting the inputs they needed from outside their local bailiwick. And so they tried to produce it completely. So they had factories that were like, Ford's factory back in the 1910s, like you pour in raw materials at one end, you get everything out of the other end. And so they try to be all inclusive, small and all inclusive and big and all inclusive. That's what they called it in China. And to a certain extent, that's for all the marketization of the last 40 years, that still prevails over much of the economy. So like you don't have an integrated market across the economy for energy. People don't trade energy between provinces and so forth. And so the renewable energy, the wind and solar, are for the most part concentrated in the west and the north and so forth, areas away from the East Coast. Where the wind is better and the sun is brighter and so forth. And so that's where you have a lot of these renewable energy plants. But the high demand for power in China is in the coastal, industrial, and big urban conglomerations. But the problem is, the planners said, okay, so we'll build these plants out there and then we'll connect them with big high power transmission lines. And they did that, and China leads the world in these high power transmission lines. The problem is that local officials in the East Coast said, no, we don't want that power from Xinjiang or Tibet or whatever. We don't want that power. We want to keep our own coal-fired power plants here. And why is that? Well, because that power, first of all, and this is a problem related to renewable energy everywhere, which is that it's intermittent. You can't depend on it 24/7. You need backup, some kind of backup. But since in China, the local power grids tend to be localized, people can't trade power and get power back and forth from other next door neighbor provinces and so forth. So it's very hard. They don't want to be dependent on suppliers way out in the West. They want to be dependent on what they have in their own place. So you find many factories have their own power plants. And there are millions of small power plants all over China. So it makes sense because these guys can control that. They have it, coal is pretty much available everywhere, and train loads of it come. And so, they can get coal anyway. So and the coal, you can burn the coal 24/7. You don't have to worry about power outages or anything like that. So coal is a very reliable, and that's the same problem in Japan or in Europe, the US or so forth. Now, in those countries, they do have an integrated power market. So as I explained in a chapter in my book, Canada and the US trade electricity across borders so that they can even out the unevenness and intermittency of solar and wind power. They trade it back and forth to compensate. But in China, there's no such market for that. Local authorities, local officials demand that they have a certain quota for energy generation in their bailiwick, and therefore they have work for their employees, so that they'll demand that that their coal-fired power plant gets to produce electricity a certain number of days or hours per day in a month or a year. And so they're able to do that. And even if the solar power comes in cheaper or it's available, they don't use it. So the problem is there's this tendency, this built-in tendency from the old Mao day economy of particularization, compartmentalization that influences the distribution of electricity in the system. So it makes it very hard for this system to be flexible and adapt to intermittency. And so what has happened is that they built up enormous big arrays of solar power and windmills and so forth like that, but they're not being used to their maximum efficiency. There's a lot of downtime on them because they're not getting the demand from the East Coast that they would like. And so they stopped. So since Xi could not overcome this problem in recent years, like 2016, 17, 18, they couldn't overcome this problem. They quit building solar power plants and windmill plants. They just put it on ice, and they took funding away from, because they said, well, they're just as efficient. We don't need to subsidize them anymore. Well, but market efficiency price efficiency is not what controls electricity distribution in China. It's bureaucratic arrangements that control it. And so they quit building these power plants, and instead he's been ramping up coal-fired power. They've just put massive investments in coal in the last years. In this article that I sent to Thomas from Bloomberg yesterday, or a day before yesterday, was about, I'm sorry, it's not from Bloomberg originally. Bloomberg took it from the Center for Energy and Energy, what's that guy's company name now? Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. It's this guy, Laurie Milaverta. He used to be the lead climate researcher, energy researcher in Greenpeace in Beijing. And now he's got his own company. Anyway, so he showed that he does a lot of research on coal in China and solar and wind. And so he showed that in this year, they just have a huge burst of coal. They've been building up the last couple of years, but this year they just went over the top. They're building more coal-fired power plants this year, in the first 6 months of this year, than they built in all of 2018 and 19. And the amount they build are equal to, as big as, all of the entire coal fleet of the United States or India, just in the first 6 months, just new construction of new power plants. And the power plant, it's not like they need these. Already there's 400% overcapacity of power plants, of coal-fired power plants in China, and they all run at like, a third speed or half speed or something like that. But, again, because it's a compartmentalized economy, it makes sense for local officials to run these plants, even if they only run at part-time speed, because they can gain from this. Whereas if they were to combine their small plants into bigger, more efficient plants that are more, not so localized, but in centralizing more ideal locations and bigger power plants, and distribute to all across the provinces or municipalities, then that would be more efficient in a capitalist sense, but not in a bureaucratic rationalist sense. So they don't do it. So they just they prefer to produce more and more coal-fired power plants that run at half speed. And it's rational in their system. So that's why they're doing that. But of course, we're not seeing what the emissions are going to be this year yet, but they're going to be just huge. I mean, this is so crazy. So that's the problem. The drivers here of this system are really intense for maximum growth and maximum pollution, and there's just hardly anything to do about it. And I was shocked about this, Thursday, I don't think I mentioned this to Frank. Thursday, Gutierrez, the president of what's his office title, the head of the UN, he was at a conference in India, and he called on the UN to he called on India to stop investing in coal-fired power and start putting resources into renewable energy. And that's great. And they really should do that. But why did he single out India for this? Because India's emissions are only 7% of global emissions, whereas China's emissions are 30% of China's global emissions. But I don't hear Gutierrez or even Trump or Greta Thunberg complaining about China's emissions. The world really needs a big campaign to bring to the attention the fact of China's huge, out of control emissions and do something about this. You know, pressure needs to be put on China to do something to bring in these emissions because they're just really off the charts.
We obviously don't want to join in the China bashing of rival capitalist corporate interests. But the massive carbon emissions coming from China can't be ignored any longer. As Smith tells it, internal criticism in China is near impossible. So it's our duty to speak up and shame China's leaders. Bill McKibben, Greta Thunberg, Robert Howarth, please take note. In New York City's Union Square, activists have set up a 62-foot digital countdown clock on a building which counts down the years, days, hours, and seconds until global warming makes disastrous climate change irreversible. As we record, the clock is down to 7 years and 97 days. There is a website about this. Check out climateclock.world.
Fan of Cuomo and the shutdown in New York. You've lauded New York for their policy. New York had the highest death rate in the world. How could we possibly be jumping up and down and saying, oh, Governor Cuomo did a great...
And we couldn't resist this brief exchange where Dr. Anthony Fauci schools Senator Rand Paul about COVID.
Great job. He had the worst death rate in the world.
No, you misconstrued that, Senator, and you've done that repetitively in the past. They got hit very badly. They've made some mistakes. Right now, if you look at what's going on right now, the things that are going on in New York to get their test positivity 1% or less is because they are looking at the guidelines that we have put together from the task force of the 4 or 5 things of masks, social distancing, outdoors more than indoors, avoiding crowds, and washing hands.
Or they've developed enough community immunity
Right.
that they're no longer having the pandemic because they have enough immunity in New York City to actually stop.
I challenge that, Senator, because I want to, please, sir, I would like to be able to do this because this happens with Senator Rand all the time. You were not listening to what the director of the CDC said, that in New York, it's about 22%. If you believe 22% is herd immunity, I believe you're alone in that.
There's also the...
That's our program for today. Stay safe, folks, but stay active. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.